Welcome to Life on God's Terms. We are so happy to have you join us today. This is a very special show. This is our Coffee and Faith session episode. And today I am joined with a very special guest, Barbara Gleeson, who is my mother. But aside from that, the best Bible teacher I've ever seen. And she has always been my spiritual mentor and in pretty much most things in life. And so I'm so happy to have her join us today. Welcome, Barbara.
Thank you, Rachel.
Thanks for joining.
I'm enjoying it.
Well, I'm excited because it's one thing to kind of have our own individual thoughts about faith and what that looks like, but I'm really excited about today's theme and what we're going to talk about, which is waiting on God. And there's a lot to be said about this topic, and there's a lot that's already been said, I think, and I wonder if there's a misunderstanding about what it actually means to wait on God.
To me, waiting on God is one of the most active things you can do because it's in constant preparation to keep yourself full in the Spirit of God so that you can hear His voice and you don't go into deception of being led by your own voice, thinking that it might be God's.
I love what you just said, and we were just talking before about this, weren't we? That sometimes we're asking the wrong question when it comes to waiting on God. Do you want to talk more about that?
You go.
Well, it was Charles Stanley, actually, I was listening to this morning, and I think you were listening to.
It was interesting. We were both listening to the same thing.
We needed motivation. I needed some encouragement, to be honest. I was like, what is... And I really enjoy his teachings. But he said sometimes we're asking the wrong question, which is not what should I do here, but what is your will in this for me? And I think sometimes I don't always ask that question. And I think sometimes he was giving an example that we've all probably had in our life where this makes sense. It ticks all the boxes. Someone wants to do something for me, or I've had a job offer. And it makes sense, but I'm praying and I'm not feeling this is the right way to go. But the question shouldn't be, should I do this? The question should be, is this in your will for me, God?
That's right.
Yeah.
And the deception is too easy to fall into. Sometimes we may want something that looks right, sounds right, but God says no, that's not right, and only He knows what's best for you. One of the things that he brought up was you have to listen to the voice of God. But the only way you can hear the voice of God is if you are listening, and that God's voice is quiet. And among the voices that are very loud, because everyone has opinions, and they will be telling you their opinions, and those voices get louder and louder, whereas God will get quieter, and to the point that unless you are literally tuning in to listen to Him, you will cease to hear Him. And that comes from being led by your own fleshly desires, because the Lord says out of His Word that sin comes when we are drawn by our own lust, our fleshly desires. So sometimes you don't realize that that's really all that's happening, is that you're wanting to hear those voices that are agreeing with your fleshly desires, what you really want to happen. And you cease to listen to that voice of God. And a surefire way, in my opinion, that you have ceased listening is ask yourself, pay attention, ask yourself, when was the last time I picked up my Bible? Because the Word of God is His Word, and it is living and breathing. It is alive. He will speak to you, and out of that whole Bible, when you pick it up, He will speak straight into that particular thing that you're in rebellion with.
Yeah.
And you don't want to be in rebellion against God. You do not want to be in rebellion. And rebellion is simply not doing what He has told you to do.
I wonder, sometimes I used to think, this was my, not struggle, but challenge in understanding, I think the truth of God's heart towards me or towards us. which was that my desires were in opposition to his will for me. But I don't actually believe that's true, because in the Bible it says that I will give you the desires of your heart if you follow me and listen to my commandments. The deeper that we go into who God really is and learn more about this, our true desires come out. And I think sometimes there's a confusion between, but I really want this. And that's the ego. That's usually the flesh, or that's the world, or maybe it's the trappings, which I've definitely, fallen into myself, of the career or the house or the this or the position, whatever it is, versus God's real desire for you. But I know now, because I've walked through it, that his real desires for you, it doesn't mean there isn't going to be sacrifice involved, but he knows your true desires. He put them there. So
exactly.
He put them there. And
exactly.
I think I wonder sometimes when I hear people talk about waiting on God, you're right. It's a very active thing.
It is.
One of the things that you have taught me the most, and someone was asking me the other day about waiting on God, and I said, every time I hear people talk about it, it's so different to how I wait on God. And when I think I need to wait on God, when I know, okay, look, there's an opportunity here, I do everything. This is what Mom taught me to do, actually, when I would call her about a job opportunity or something. Number one is obviously you pray. You don't do anything before you do that. But number two is, if you really think this is for you, and you're not sure yet, maybe you don't have the answer, or everything is like, well, I just need to take the next step here. Do everything that you can do to explore this opportunity or to make that happen. Do the best you can do in this situation. And then you give it to God. And that's it. And that's it. Then it's over to him. But there's a limit to what we can do or the answers we do have. And I think the other thing is, if I think of it in terms of, say, a job opportunity, there's been so many times when there's been jobs on the table or roles, back in the day. And I would sit there and do not be rushed. Do not be rushed. I've made so many mistakes in that because it felt right or they needed a deadline. No. Satan rushes.
Yes, he does.
He does, doesn't he?
Yes, he does.
And if someone is rushing you, that's a flag.
Back off.
Back off. I think that's something I've had to learn the hard way.
Yeah.
And I think that's a big one that I would say in terms of what waiting on God looks like. It doesn't look pushy. That's what it doesn't look like. There's peace involved.
Yeah.
There's time and wisdom and consideration, and Proverbs, Solomon talks about that. And I think we have to give ourselves the time. If you're going to build a house, you have to count the cost of the tools and the time to build that foundation. So I think those are a little bit more practical tools in my, when I think of what waiting on God looks like. It's not you're just waiting to see when God shows up with a sign one day. And it does say in the Bible, asking you shall receive. Ask for the wisdom. Be really specific on what you need the clarity on, right?
Yeah, exactly. And wisdom is something that he tells us to ask for. He tells us to ask for wisdom and to also ask for understanding and to ask for discernment. And so he calls understanding the sister of wisdom. So when you ask for wisdom, always ask for understanding. And you need discernment. So ask for the discernment. But wisdom is, God is full of wisdom and knowledge. And so he is going to give you what you're asking for. His eyes roam to and fro across the earth. His ears his ears are listening to those who speak often on his name. So you already know that his eyes have caught you. His ears have heard you. So if you just visualize it like this, that he's in his throne room and he has got a creation of people that he has created in his image. And he created them to love him and to want to worship him. He put eternity in their heart so every man is without excuse, that they can see and know that there is a true living God who has created the world and all that is in it, and you as well. And so you could just, if you can picture him looking and knowing that so many have not turned to him, and in that whole vast earth, he hears you talking about him. Now, can you imagine our Creator just pausing and going, Salah? Listen to that. So when you're praying to him, he is going to listen quickly because he hears those who call often on his name. He knows your voice. You're that sweet incense before him. She needs me. So yeah, whenever there's a need that we have in our life, and he is the abundance of everything we need, he says he has it above and beyond, because I came to give you life and give it more abundantly, but wait on me. I will lead you. Ask for the wisdom. I will give you the wisdom, but listen to my voice. And I was noticing something in the Word yesterday, and it links in with this, but I couldn't help but notice how many times the Lord says to be careful regarding being careful about obeying the commandments. This is the Old Testament, and this is in Numbers, I think it was. The opposite of being careful is being unconcerned. Just that one word, unconcerned. What does that say? It's saying, I'm unconcerned about what God says in his word. And yet, if I really love him, I am going to be careful. He kept saying, God says, be careful to do all that I've asked of you. Be careful to obey the commandments. Be careful. And I just went, Jesus was always careful. I never thought it and saw it that way before. But in waiting on God, we must be careful to keep ourselves, to keep our hearts right, so that God can speak to us, because you can believe that the enemy is going to be at an opportune moment to come in to bring an Ishmael into your life. So this is the Ishmaels are those when we give into our flesh and we want to have a quick blessing and we want to go ahead and make it happen. We are on a schedule and we're not trusting God's Spirit. We are just trusting a schedule. And so the Ishmael comes from, of course, when Sarah and Abram at the time, Abram and Sarah, and God promised them the baby, a child. And so in the interim of waiting, Sarah got impatient. Yeah. And the schedule in her mind was, well, he said we would have a baby and I can use my maidservant.
This isn't happening, so I need to step in and make this happen.
Exactly.
And I think I can certainly relate to Sarah in that way. I think we've all had our Sarah moments, if I'm honest. Even though that clearly wasn't in God's design for a baby to come out that way. And we're now dealing with a lot of issues hundreds of years later as a result of that decision, which is incredible. But I think we can all relate to taking it into our own hands. And I think it's actually such a worldly solution, isn't it? It's a worldly way of dealing with it. And I can get not confused, but I can easily step over that, that line of, because I am the type A, let's go. I want to get things done. I don't want to sit passively. It is not comfortable for me. That's not the way God made me, So but there's a time, and we all know it when we spend time with him. Yeah. When it's time to sit back and wait and give it over to him. Yeah. And I think it just goes back to what you just said before of, you have to be disciplined enough to spend time with him. And that can be really hard, especially in your early mothering years, for example. And that's why a lot of women, who was the woman that did the apron over?
Susanna Wesley
did the apron over her head because that was as much time as she got to herself.
Because she had something like 10 children or more.
Exactly. We're not, most of us don't have an hour and a half in the mornings to do, Bible studies or whatever. I wish, I could say I do, but I don't. I'm probably a 10 or 20 minute devotional audio, most days, or it's in my car. My car is my place where I do most of my worship or, God stuff. So but whatever it is, it's being intentional about tuning into however God speaks to you. That is waiting on God, and even if it's you hear nothing, but I'm putting on worship music for 10 minutes and that's my time with him, that's filling you up with him. And I think it's taking away the rules of what that looks like, but going, this is my sacred time for him, that I'm going to be filled with him, with his knowledge or with his word, and I'm going to sit here and wait on him in this way. And if you do that regularly, if you find that way, you will know when to sit back and you will know when to step forward. And you will know when to pick up the phone or when to try and make that happen yourself.
It's building character. God is using that time to find out what is in your heart and to train you to trust Him. Yeah. And so when we're waiting on God, when we're waiting on that promise, when we're waiting, you're actively doing what you should do, but recognize that everything that we do, God is building character. He is building faith. He is building trust. And He's also exposing and revealing what's in our heart. And what is in our heart is the most important thing to Him because, that's the life of us. He says, guard your heart, for out of it are all the issues of life. I'm just reminded of something that I'm hoping I had written it down. It was in my other book, but the Lord, when He speaks to us, it is so personal and so individual, and He knows our heart. He knows what's in it. And I come back to that word that says, for He knew the depravity of man's heart. He knows how evil and wicked we are on our own without Him. And in a moment without Him, we can become that again.
Yeah.
But that's why He says in Him, when we're waiting, He wants us to know more about in Him who He is, because He wants that character of Him to be fortified in us as He reveals to us what is in us, which is horrifying when we recognize it.
Yeah, it's ugly.
It is ugly.
And I think if I can jump in, I'm seeing it. Mothering a 5-year-old is interesting because it's not even the waiting. If he wants something, it's the posture of the waiting. The posture of us while we're waiting. Am I going to wait and grumble against God? Which the Israelites showed us. It didn't have to be 40 years, guys.
No.
And I actually think that will affect the timeline of our journey. Right?
Well, it does.
It does. So the timeline of the blessing depends a lot on the posture of our waiting. And I think that's something we're not always, it's like, oh, I don't have any control here. I'm just waiting on God. You do have, this is a co-creation. This is a co-relationship. This is you're in charge of a lot here, So it's our posture that He is working on and bringing out these things that need to be dealt with. But they can be dealt with quickly if you're willing to confront it and take that medicine.
Yes.
But some of us aren't. I know I've struggled with a few things and keep going around that mountain on. I think that's something that is not always, not always reflected on. Can you think of an example of how you had to wait on God, or when waiting on God took a different turn?
I truly cannot.
Okay, let me ask you this. Say if you had a decision of whether to move to a different country, did you have to wait on God for that decision? Just a thought. Or
No, I didn't. It was as clear as night and day.
So that decision, you had the peace.
Yeah. I had the peace and the clarity. I didn't have an ounce of fear about any of it. I never did. Yeah, I had a lot of voices that did not agree with what I was doing.
Because you were so tuned in.
And that's the power.
Yeah.
That is the power of knowing the voice of God, because
versus the voice of people.
Versus the voice of people.
And I think that's one thing that people talk about. Ignore the voices. You can't if you don't have any other voice that you're tuning into. If those are the only voices that are present, if there isn't one that's strong enough inside of you, what else are you going to listen to?
That's right.
What other decisions can you make?
Do you know, it's interesting. 2 nights ago, Mark and I were talking, and we just said, it was a real conversation about that. And I just said, we've been married for 25 years now.
Wow.
And I said, we've had a very good life. And he went, we sure have. He said, look what we would have missed out on if we had not continued with what we believed was
the right thing. And he had his own people too going, it was so, it was very different for the time.
But the point is that that's why it's so important to know the voice of God.
Yeah.
Because while this was a beautiful blessing, and yes, what would we have missed out on? On the flip side of it, let's just say that I was in a different scenario and God was saying, no, absolutely not. But I chose my own way. I mean, can you imagine being in another country with the wrong person? It is a life and death detrimental to you to hear and know the voice of God and not be deceived by it.
Yeah.
Because of your own lust of what you want and what seems right and feels right. And oh, what a blessing.
Yeah.
But I have known a time that God has literally, and that's the way I've called it, where he picked me up by the head of my hair is where I felt it and removed me from a place because I was too spiritually young and immature to understand that where I was very cultish.
Yes. Yeah.
And I was easily manipulated because of this respect of elders and the fear of speaking against a godly man or all those things that come under the heading of a good Christian does not do this. But literally, God is so protective over his children, and he knows who you are, where you're at, and where your maturity level is. And he literally picked me up and removed me himself. And that's when God is just being that protective father, and he will protect you, but he will say, as loud as you can hear, he will say no to you. But if you refuse to listen to that voice, he also will go quiet and silent.
You always said he's a gentleman.
He is a gentleman.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, the world doesn't know enough gentlemen to know what a gentleman
don't
is.
They don't force the door open.
That's right.
Yeah, they'll be there, and they will be there. The one example I'll share, I think, before we start to wrap this up, and this is just, again, showing my lack of, I guess, spiritual expertise, if you will, but back when I was in my late 20s and there was an apartment I was convinced I wanted to rent, and it was in the same building as my now husband, but boyfriend at the time. I was like, oh, this will be great. We'll be nice and close to each other. And I'd even told Mom about it. Let's pray about it. Oh, great. I go in there, and I was the only one looking at this apartment. And Shane was like, and the truth is, it looked fine. It was. Mom's laughing.
Go ahead.
It's so ridiculous. And I looked at the apartment, and everything looked fine. And I walked out, and Shane was like, well, it's great. What are you going to do? And I said, yeah, I guess I'll, think about it, fill out the application. And I called, I guess I didn't speak to you until that Monday, because all I remember is that Monday, I get a phone call from a real estate agent. I hadn't even applied for the apartment. And they were like, hey, the apartment is yours. And I was like, what? I haven't even applied, because I did not feel at peace about it. And I didn't know why. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something didn't feel right to me. And just enough for me to know, especially when it came to apartments, I was like, what am I missing here? And I didn't know what it was, because it made sense. It ticked every box I had. It was right where I needed it to be. I couldn't make sense. Well, Barbara got involved because she's a mama bear, even though I was 28. She contacted this real estate and said, please give it to my daughter. The real estate agent calls me and is like, the apartment's yours. I don't know what she said to him, but was clearly very convincing. And then I called Mom, and she was so excited. Did you get it? Did you get the apartment? And I'm like, yeah, look, I don't know if this is for me. And Mom was shocked. What do you mean it's not for you? Because I didn't know you'd gotten involved at that point in the Sydney real estate agency. It was crazy. I was embarrassed anyway. And but it didn't make sense, because it ticked every box I wanted. And we prayed about it. And I said, there's something not right, and I don't know what it is. And we prayed, and you said, I agree with you. And so I've never been offered an apartment more quickly in my life. I had multiple calls. It's in, whatever you need. It was because of Barbara's doing the mama bear thing. And I said, no, thank you. And it didn't make any sense, because I needed a place to live. And what happened was there was another apartment on the same road, much better. But a week later, that apartment flooded. And I will never forget that moment, because he was saving me from that frustration, from all of that, would have been had I been dealing with that. But more than that, I didn't feel at peace. And that moment sticks with me, because it was such a practical example of how God when we listen to him, when we listen to that feeling of peace, that this just doesn't feel right, that he is saving you, he's protecting you. He really does have your best in mind when it comes to those decisions.
That he does.
That he does. And it's always helpful to have a mother too who cares. But anyway, look, I think that has gone into a lot of wonderful different directions. Thank you so much for joining us, Mom. Thank you for your wisdom today. It's been wonderful. And yeah, what a wonderful reminder just to lean in to God in whatever way we can in this season. So thank you for joining.
I enjoyed it. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much for joining, and hope to see you next time.